unpacking an eventful election night 2025. We're talking about Shutdown Day 37 and President Trump's tariffs are at the Supreme Court. All of that and so much more today on 10-Minute Drill.
Everybody get up, get up.
The story of America is the story of an adventure.
I can hear you. The rest of the world hears you.
We are a nation under God, and I believe God intended for us to be free.
Tuesday night was an eventful election night 2025. First in New Jersey, Democrat Mikey Sherrill won with 56% of the vote. Down in Virginia, gubernatorial candidate Abigail Spanberger won with 57% of the vote. And in the closely watched attorney's general race, violent criminal Jay Jones won with 52.7% of the vote. Now, a couple important points I want to talk about here first. This was a rough night for Republicans. You would like to see wins in nationally televised election results, but it's important to remember these are blue states, blue jurisdictions that Democrats were always projected to win. Would have been great to see Miyares win the Virginia Attorney's General race because Jay Jones proved himself to be a psychopath. But one of the challenges in Virginia is the fact that there is not ticket splitting. And the fact that Winsome Sears, the gubernatorial candidate, lost by about 15 points made it near impossible for Miyares, who ran close to 10 points ahead of Winsome Sears in that race, to be able to win. 4 years ago, Glenn Youngkin won in Virginia, but only because of a perfect storm of circumstances. For one, Joe Biden had created the worst political environment for Democrats in several years. Two, Terry McAuliffe, the Democrat candidate, had one of the worst gaffes we've seen in decades when he said parents have no right to tell schools what to teach their children. There was also a series of major scandals in Northern Virginia schools that had parents on edge and had independent voters shopping around for alternatives to the Democrats who had put that system in place. But I also would note that Glenn Youngkin was a unicorn candidate, one of the best we've seen in a long time, who ran a very, very safe, smart race in a perfect environment and still was only able to win by 2 points because, again, Virginia is a blue state. And in both of these major races, both in New Jersey and in Virginia, Democrats heavily outspent Republicans. So my takeaway on this is do not overread this as doom and gloom, but at the same time, do not miss the important lessons and takeaways because there are warning signs ahead of next year's midterms that Republicans cannot afford to ignore. I have 4 takeaways from the elections that Republicans will be watching. First, the shift in female voters. Women aged 18 to 29, 81% voted for Mamdani in New York, 80% for Sherrill in New Jersey, and 78% for Spanberger in Virginia. Another key dynamic to watch, Hispanic voters. Hispanic voters put President Trump over the edge in 2024 in a number of key states. We've seen about 25 to 30% of those voters shift back to Democrats in Virginia and New Jersey, which is a troubling sign. Many people in the media are pointing to President Trump's immigration policies, ICE raids, but I think cost of living, which drove the entire electorate on Tuesday night, had a lot more to do with it. Another key dynamic that we're watching is that cost of living voters issue. Even if Republicans can draw a direct line between Democrat policies on things like energy and the rising costs on things like utility bills, Democrats were very successful in evading that blame and pointing it back at President Trump, who has taken over the ownership of the economy with things like his tariff plans. And this will be an issue for Republicans. There was not a lot of conversation from the candidates on Tuesday night about cost of living. There was some effort to tie particularly Mikey Sherrill in New Jersey to the rising utility costs, but I think she danced around that fairly well. And Jack Ciattarelli talked a lot more about taxes than about finding ways to lower costs for people. But that will be Democrats' playbook going into the midterms. This will be the strategy that they rely on, is to continue to say President Trump and his policies, supported by Republicans, are driving up everyone's cost of living. Let's look at this one exit poll from New York, which we'll go to more in just a second. Per NBC exits, Mamdani lost immigration voters by 26 points and crime voters by 41 points. But he won cost of living voters by 36 points, and they represented 55% of the electorate. Very similar in Virginia, where 51% of voters said the push for trans rights has gone too far, which would align with Winsome Sears' campaign focus. The problem is that was not one of voters' top priorities, and far more were focused on the cost of living issue that Abigail Spanberger very successfully pushed against against Republicans. So Republicans will need to do a better job of focusing on how their policies are an effort to lower costs for people. When you compare what inflation was under Joe Biden to what it is under President Trump, it's not comparable. There are things that President Trump's continuing to do to focus on that, particularly when it comes to energy, utility bills, food costs, things like that. President Trump also is going to continue to focus on his tariff messaging and trying to make sure people understand his goal is to lower costs for people. But the problem right now is Democrats have successfully turned that into a political albatross against Republicans. The number 4 point I'd make here is that partisanship is a heck of a drug and a massive driver of voter enthusiasm. For example, in the Virginia Attorney General race, many people believed the texting scandal would be enough to doom Jay Jones. But in some exit polls, only 46% of people found it disqualifying. A lot of people found it concerning, but they were still willing to vote for Jay Jones in large part because he had a D by his name, and in Virginia, there is not a lot of ticket splitting. On to the race that the media seems to be most focused on, the New York mayoral race, where Zohran Mamdani, the communist, won with 50% of the vote. Here's a clip of Mamdani's victory message, which was very chilling for everyone.
We will prove that there is no problem too large for government to solve and no concern too small.
Now that is a scary message. Many of us grew up hearing the Reagan version of that, which was the 9 scariest words in the English language are, I'm from the government and I'm here to help. And when you hear Zohran talk about how there's no problem too big or too small for government, think about the last time you went to the DMV or tried to do anything with the post office. I think that the voters of New York are going to find out very, very quickly that there are a lot of things they don't want government to try to do. For example, the first time they spend their afternoon in a bread line outside of a government-controlled grocery store. But this is the choice that Democrats have made. Now, Speaker Mike Johnson believes this is an advantage for Republicans.
The reason I'm optimistic is they've handed the keys to the kingdom to the Marxist, and he will destroy it.
President Trump is also trying to use this Zohran Mamdani win to point to the far, far left Democrats taking over their party.
The decision facing all Americans could not be more clear. We have a choice between communism and common sense.
The proof will be in the pudding here. Now, I believe that President Trump is right about that. As people see Zohran Mamdani's policies play out, they're going to realize that the far left socialist approach isn't actually helpful to people's lives. The problem for us leading up to this is that the word socialism isn't the boogeyman that a lot of Republican consultants want it to be. We would like people to hear socialism and say, I got to run away from that. The problem is your average voter on the street doesn't think about it in the historical context. They think right now my cost of living is too high. This guy's ideas sound like they might help it. And whether or not somebody labels him as a socialist doesn't carry the same weight to your average voter who's not thinking in terms of historical context. So Republicans will have to do a good job of ensuring that as challenges come from Zohran's policies, people are making the connection to their lives. On Tuesday night, right as polls were closing, Punchbowl News reported there are now more than a dozen Senate Dems engaging with Rs on reopening the government, according to senators' aides familiar with the matter. New signs of optimism after Dem lunch, as the shutdown is set to become the longest ever. Imagine that. Many people pointed to the fact that Democrats were trying to prolong this shutdown to increase voter anxiety in hopes they'd point it at President Trump and turn out on Election Day. The fact that Democrats are coming to the table literally at the end of this election as votes are starting to be counted is a pretty big tell. But not to be outdone, here's a letter from Chuck Schumer and Hakeem Jeffries. The morning after the election, Schumer and Jeffries wrote a letter demanding a bipartisan meeting of legislative leaders to end the GOP shutdown of the federal government. One point of note here is this conversation has also shifted to a conversation about the filibuster, with President Trump putting pressure on Republicans to end the filibuster. Now, the filibuster, for those watching at home, is the rule that requires 60 votes to pass a bill to fund the government. You can't do it with a simple majority like the House of Representatives. The Senate was built to require deliberation and to require compromise, which is why there is a 60-vote requirement. There are 53 Republicans in the Senate, which is why we currently have this shutdown. We can't get 7 Democrats to come to the table. Now, the problem with President Trump's encouragement to end the filibuster is that's exactly what Democrats want. They have been open about it because Democrats will do far more with power if there's no filibuster than Republicans would be willing to do. Democrats have been open about their willingness to destroy the Supreme Court by adding seats to it in order to counter the current majority if they got power. They've been open about wanting to turn D.C. into a state, even though the Constitution suggests it cannot be its own state. And it would be the most far-left, radically absurd state in the Union. They want to add Puerto Rico as another state. They want to ban voter ID. They want to make all sorts of crazy election laws like banning taking dead people off voter rolls. We've seen that tried before. So the filibuster is the last thing that has prevented that from happening thus far in the country, which is why Republicans are holding out to protect it. Yesterday, the Supreme Court heard oral arguments on the case against President Trump's authority to leverage tariffs against other countries. At issue here is President Trump's invocation of an authority called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, which is a federal law giving the president power to oversee commerce under certain emergency standards. Justices on the Supreme Court had a lot of questions for the lawyers representing the Trump administration, including things like, couldn't a future Democrat president use this emergency authority for things like declaring a climate emergency in order to shut down commerce of gas-powered vehicles, things like that? And the attorneys for the Trump administration acknowledged, yes, they would have that power under our interpretation of this rule. A lot of pundits believe the Supreme Court will actually strike this down. A number of congressional Republicans, even President Trump's allies, have raised concerns about the presidential authority being used for tariffs, which is traditionally an authority given to Congress. However, the president's authority does include foreign policy. And so there is a little bit of a long disconnect there that President Trump has tried to take advantage of that the Supreme Court will give some finality to with their decision on this case. For our You Can't Make It Up segment today, we've talked a lot about how climate activists have gone after so many things that make our lives easier. Gas-powered cars, gas stoves, utilities that we like and enjoy. Well, their latest target is household pets.
Pets bring us joy, but they also leave a surprising paw print on the planet.
Yeah, when it comes to those environmental impacts, it's their food, basically, and in particular, the ingredients in their food.
That is from the Associated Press. Not only are we getting lectured about pets' contribution to climate change by the Associated Press, but they brought in a British person to do that. Who needed that? For fun today, we had ChatGPT help us with a little experiment, comparing the climate contribution of 10 small dogs to 10 climate journalists. 10 small dogs typically contribute 0.5 to 1 ton of CO2 equivalent per year. Over a 10-year lifespan, roughly 5 to 10 tons of CO2 per dog. Compare that to 10 journalists. The American adult is responsible for about 15 to 20 tons of CO2 per year. Over a 10-year period, that is 200 tons per journalist. For 10 journalists, about 2,000 tons. So, in conclusion, 10 climate reporters contribute 20 to 40 times more greenhouse gases than 10 small dogs. And I think if we had to choose who is more important. So it's been a while, but we're going to do another viewer mail segment today because we've got some really great comments from people and we do love feedback. Please leave us more feedback. From Josh S5B7D, is this the guy from the podcast with 4 guys? This is a podcast with 1 guy. Just me. There are other fun people in the room helping us make it happen, but I believe you're thinking of the Ruthless Variety Program, who are our very good friends. Another comment from Bearded BA for Real. Been in media nearly 50 years, and public affairs has been the platform for in-depth conversation and analysis. This 10-minute moment is fast becoming my go-to source to kickstart information with facts, brevity, and great presentation. Love the fact that your quarterbacking style lends itself to realism. It is a sharp demarcation from the polished, packaged, and often repugnant empty suits that deliver self-importance. Thank you very much. That is an incredibly kind comment. I don't believe this is anybody related to me or somebody who's just doing this to be nice, but that is exactly what we're going for with the 10-minute drill. So Bearded BA for Real, we appreciate you, and we hope you'll keep watching. Last comment from Linda Balzer 1679. You inform us about pertinent political info in a short time. Thank you. Well, thank you, Linda. That is exactly what we are going for. We appreciate you and all of our viewers, listeners, and commenters. Please, just like Linda here, leave us a review, leave us a comment, leave us a reply. Tell us something you'd like to hear more about. We very much appreciate it. That is all the time we have for today. Please have a great afternoon.